The cold hadn't broken in 9 days, and the snow outside hissed like sand on glass. He slid the iron lid back and fed another split log to the fire that had kept him breathing through every white-drowned night. Before we ride further, tell us where you're listening from, and if Frontier Tales speak to you, hitch your horse at the channel and stay for tomorrow's story. The wind had gone quiet, which Micah Hollis knew meant worse was coming. Out past the cabin window, the sky had turned the color of lead, and the kind of stillness settled in that made even the crows nervous. A gray light hung over the snow-covered flats, thick as smoke and just as choking. By noon that day, he'd stopped counting how long it had been since he'd seen a living soul or felt the sun on his neck. The cold had rolled in early that year, early and deep, and now it just stayed, a visitor with no plans to leave. It was the 3rd week of November in the year 1887, though Micah hadn't seen a calendar since the storm hit. What he did see was snow drifted high enough to blur the windows and a fire pit that had burned almost constant for what had to be over 3 weeks. The woodpile stacked behind the shack had once looked like too much. Now it looked like a poor guess. He crouched over the iron-ringed hole in the middle of the cabin floor, a pit he'd dug and lined with stone during the dry months, while the other ranch hands drank and played cards. Most men on the range thought he was touched for putting a fire in the floor. "Wood burns up, Hollis," one had said. "You want to burn your boots off?" But Micah hadn't argued. He'd just kept digging. Now, the fire inside that pit was the only thing keeping his bones from freezing stiff. It gave off a low, steady heat that didn't rise too fast or vanish too quick, like an old mule that didn't work fast but never stopped pulling. It was warmth that stayed in the cabin, not up the flue, into the teeth of the wind. He reached for another split log and eased it in slow. The iron lid, wide and flat like a wagon wheel, sat nearby, waiting for the next time the wind started acting tricky. Outside, the snow whispered against the walls like it wanted in. Inside, Micah listened to the pop of resin in the pine logs, the only sound besides the slow grind of the storm building back up. The cold in Dakota Territory was always cruel, but this year it had teeth. He sat back on his heels, gloved hands resting on his knees. His breath curled in the air, but not thick the fire was holding. For now. He'd made a mistake staying up here this late in the year. He knew it. But the cattle run had gone long, and there wasn't a soul left to blame. He looked toward the window, toward the nothing beyond it. 26 days, he muttered, his voice rough and low. Just hold out 26 more. And then he added another log to the fire. Back in late August, while the plains still smelled like dry grass and old cattle, Micah Hollis had gone to digging. The others had laughed. Roy Penner said he was turning the shack into a root cellar. Gus, from the neighboring claim, said he'd probably bury himself just to save time come winter, but Micah kept working. Every day after sunfall, when the other hands rolled dice or passed the bottle, he brought his spade inside the empty cabin and went to work carving a circle into the center of the floor. It wasn't just dirt he was digging through. It was memory. Back when Micah was 19 younger than the dust on his boots now, he'd spent a winter with an old Mescalero scout named Tomas, who'd shown him how to burn heat long after the flames had gone. They'd built pits in the desert, lined them with stone, sealed them with sand and ash. Tomas called them sleeping fires. Micah never forgot. So when this shack came to him, little more than 4 walls and a roof pitched too low, he remembered Tomas's pit. But he had something better this time. Stone from the creek bed, a rusted wagon wheel rim he'd salvaged, and enough time before the snow came. By the end of August, he'd dug down nearly 2 feet. He lined the hole with small, flat rocks from the river ones he'd hauled a half-mile by hand. Then came the rim, sunk deep and flush with the floorboards, like the mouth of a well. He mortared it with a mix of sand and ash and left it to cure. No one helped, no one asked. Let the fool burn himself down, they figured. But Micah knew what he was doing. Heat that started low stayed low. Heat that was trapped below your knees had a way of rising slow, warming everything as it went, not just the air, but the boots, the boards, the marrow. In September, he brought in scrap iron from the abandoned siding 5 miles west. melted it down in a borrowed forge, hammered out a lid wide and heavy with a handle strong enough to lift with a gloved hand. It would cover the pit in storms, damp down the burn, and keep the wind from drawing out what little warmth he had. The last part came from an old trick he learned working trail cook on a cattle drive through Sonora, a vent channel dug shallow and long, angling toward the rear wall. When lit right, the fire would pull fresh air low and push the smoke out high. No chimney, no signal, no loss of heat. He'd built it all with hands calloused from saddles and years of being wrong. This time, he didn't care who laughed. By the time the first snow came, Micah's secret was buried in the floor, and when the cold hit, it was the only thing that held. By the 12th day of snow, Micah Hollis had run the numbers in his head so many times he'd memorized the way the wood cracked. Every log had its own voice. The pine hissed low and wet when split too green. The elm snapped clean and gave a slow burn, but needed coaxing to start. The old cottonwood slabs he'd dragged from the riverbank last spring burned hot, fast, too fast. He saved those for mornings when frost clung to the rafters like spider silk. His wood pile, once tall enough to shoulder lean against, was shrinking. Each log fed the fire pit below his shack, the only thing that kept the wind from turning his blood to slush. But Micah wasn't just burning wood, he was burning time. He paced it out in days. Not on a calendar, because he didn't have one, but by how much ash settled each night, how much warmth the stones in the floor still held come dawn, how many sticks it took to raise the room from freezing to just bearable. He'd kept a small stack by the pit, 7 logs, precisely split, exactly measured. Each morning he used one. Each evening another. If he could get by on 2 a day, he'd last nearly 4 weeks. Longer if the storms let up, shorter if they didn't. But this storm hadn't let up, not once. The fire pit was holding, though. That was something. He'd learned how to bank the coals, push the embers deep into the stone ring, smother them with ash, leave just enough breath to keep them alive till morning. When he woke, all he had to do was stir the pit, feed in a sliver of pine, and the glow would come back like memory, slow, red, and steady. It saved matches. It saved strength. Micah kept a tin cup nailed beside the door. Every night he dropped in a pinch of ash, black and fine, soft as flour. It was his clock. When the cup filled, he'd know how long the fire had lasted, how long the shack had stayed warm enough to live. On that 12th night, the wind came down like a hammer. It moaned across the plains and screamed through the cracks around the shutterboards, but it didn't touch the floor. There, it was warm, just warm enough. He crouched beside the pit and brushed the iron lid with the back of his glove. Warm, not hot, but there. He added 1 log. Just one, no more. Outside, the cold scratched at the door, impatient. Inside, the stones in the floor held the days burn like a promise. Micah sat with his back to the wall and listened to the wood settle. It wasn't comfort. It was calculation. He could trade comfort for survival. He'd done it before. If the fire kept burning 2 logs a day, he'd make it. He just had to keep counting the ash. The cabin floor never steamed, never smoked, never creaked from heat. But if you knelt close, palms to the boards, you could feel it like the memory of a campfire long gone cold, still whispering through the grain. Micah Hollis had built it that way on purpose. He'd known from the start that if the heat shot up too fast, it'd be wasted. The whole point of sinking the fire pit low was to slow it, to hold warmth the way the desert held sun. It wasn't about the flames, it was about what the fire touched and what the fire kept. The stones were the secret. Micah had lined the pit with river rock and clay-packed gaps, shaped to hold and release heat like lungs taking breath. Once warmed, those stones would stay hot for hours, sometimes through the night. Even when the fire dropped to coals, the floor stayed mild, steady, quiet. He didn't sleep close to the pit that was a greenhorn's mistake. The real warmth pooled across the floor in slow ripples, settling beneath his cot, beneath the shelves, beneath the low bench where he stripped bark and sharpened his old skinning knife. No place was blazing hot, but no place was deadly cold. That was the difference. In a frontier shack, heat usually climbed straight up. A man could sweat near the ceiling rafters while his feet turned numb below. That's why most cabins used bunks hung high on the wall to sleep in the warm air, but Micah slept low. Let the warmth come to him. Let the fire lift it from the floor in waves he didn't need to chase. It made him think of cattle huddled in storm pens, bodies pressed together, breathing into each other's hides. That kind of warmth wasn't flashy. It didn't crackle, but it saved lives. Micah dragged his fingers across the rim of the pit. The iron was warm, not hot. That was good. It meant the heat had sunk, not escaped. He adjusted one of the river stones slightly. It had shifted when he stoked the flames earlier and tucked it back in place like a puzzle piece. No smoke in the room, no creosote smell. His trench vent, the one that snaked behind the rear wall, was still drawing right. The air was clean, the light low, the warmth even. The dog-eared shack might not have looked like much, but Micah's fire pit made it a chamber of survival. Every part of it was built to keep heat close, to hold it where it mattered. He crossed the room in slow steps, listening to the floor whisper beneath his boots. No creak, no cold spot, just the steady hush of warmth being released back into the room like an old friend. Somewhere out on the plains, another cowboy was freezing, probably wishing for more blankets, more kerosene, more luck. Micah just fed one, more log into the floor, and closed the lid slow. Let the heat rise in silence. There was a second secret to the fire pit, one that kept Micah alive just as much as the heat did. It never smoked. Not the way a stove might, not the way a chimney would. There was no curling black ribbon rising from the roof, no scent on the wind that said a man's alive in here. Just the hush of the storm and the faintest scent of pine smoke tucked low in the room. That was the smoke trick. He'd started digging the vent in early September, a shallow trench that ran beneath the cabin floor and angled up behind the rear wall. No bricks, no chimney, just packed earth and a length of scavenged stovepipe he'd buried in the ground like a trail. The opening was hidden behind a clump of brush and half covered with snow by now. Even if someone passed within 10 yards of the shack, they'd never see it. That was the point. Back in New Mexico territory, he'd once seen a scout use a buried vent to keep a cook fire hidden from the Comanche. That fire had fed 20 men and never been spotted. Micah had remembered. You didn't just build to stay warm, you built not to be found. The trick worked because if draw hot air rose, cold air pressed in to take its place. If you dug it right, a low vent could pull air across the coals and send the smoke drifting out far from where it started. No roar, no stink, no signal. It also kept the room from choking. The pit didn't just warm the floor, it breathed. The vent created a slow pull that cleared the air without robbing the heat. Micah could keep the lid cracked an inch or two and let the smoke trickle out without ever letting the cold sneak in. He'd tested it the first night he lit the pit, just a small fire, one log, lid off. He'd waited, breath held, watching. The smoke lifted gently, traced the rim, then slid sideways, vanished, like a ghost walking backwards. Now it was habit. He'd light the fire, wait for the draft to catch, then lower the lid. The heat would stay. The smoke would leave. The cabin remained warm, quiet, invisible. It had saved him more than once. Last week, before the storm hit full, he'd heard hoofbeats in the night. Just one rider, maybe two. Didn't stop, didn't knock. Whoever it was rode on past, probably saw nothing, smelled nothing, probably thought the cabin was abandoned. Let them think it. Micah didn't need company. Company meant mouths, meant noise, meant splitting wood thinner than it could bear. He stirred the pit with an iron poker, watching the smoke draw clean and low into the trench. Not a wisp drifted back into the room. Not a flicker touched the rafters. This cabin didn't burn like the others. It breathed. And as long as it breathed, he could live. The wind changed sometime after midnight, not louder, but meaner. It carried a sharpness that felt less like air and more like broken glass. Micah Hollis woke with a jolt, not from cold, but from the silence that followed it. Something was wrong. He rolled from his cot, boots half-laced, and crossed the room in 3 careful steps. He reached for the door, tried the latch. It didn't budge. He pressed harder. Nothing. Just the dead weight of snow, frozen solid around the frame like the earth had decided to seal him in. He dropped to one knee, squinting near the bottom. Frost had crept all the way across the inside planks, not moisture, but full ice, thick, white, and stubborn. He pressed his gloved hand to the seam. The wood was colder than metal. The storm must have shifted while he slept, driving snow directly against the eastern wall. That door, which had creaked since he built it, now wouldn't move at all. He wasn't locked in by a bolt. He was entombed. Micah didn't panic. He crossed to the fire pit, still glowing, though low, and stirred the coals with his iron rod. A puff of warmth met his face. He added 1 small log, then 2. Sat back and watched. The heat would need to do more than warm the air now. It had to fight the ice. He moved through the cabin, slow and steady, checking the shutters frostbitten but intact. The rear vent still breathed. That was good. But every seam in the floor, every board in the wall, felt like it was trying to shrink inward, pulled tight by the kind of cold that came once every 10 winters. He opened the cabinet and pulled down the last of the salt pork, wrapped in wax cloth, and a tin of hard biscuit. No coffee, no stew, just fuel. He ate it without complaint, chewing slow, eyes never leaving the fire. He wasn't worried about air. The vent would see to that. But if the door stayed shut, he'd have no way to check the woodpile outside. No way to gather kindling, no way to hunt or trap. Not that anything was moving out there anyway. That left what was inside. The small stack behind the cot. The bundle beneath the table. The crates he'd left broken down near the back wall. If he had to, he could burn the chair. He'd slept on the floor before. He could do it again. Outside, the storm slammed the walls hard enough to rattle the nails. Inside, the fire caught and lifted a low orange breath that spread slowly across the stones, into the pit, and back into the room. The floor warmed under his knees. Micah stared at the frozen door and muttered to himself, "Let it stay shut." He put the iron lid back in place and lay down by the fire. The cold could howl all it wanted. He wasn't going anywhere. By mid-morning, Micah Hollis knew the math no longer favored him. He'd burned through the last of the stacked kindling, the pile behind the cot reduced to splinters and bark. The neat row of split logs by the pit now stood just 3 pieces high. He didn't need a ledger to see the problem. He had maybe 2 days of clean fuel left, 3 if he stretched it cruel. He knelt by the fire pit and lifted the iron lid. The coals inside blinked red, still breathing, but slower now, hungrier. He fed in a half log and sealed the lid again, already regretting the cost. The door was still frozen shut. That hadn't changed. The wind had eased, but the temperature hadn't. If anything, it had settled into that deep, hateful freeze that didn't scream anymore, just waited. Micah stood and looked around the cabin. The time for comfort was over. He pried loose the crates he'd used as storage, kicked them into planks with 3 solid blows, and began breaking them into burnable pieces. They weren't seasoned wood. They'd smoke and spit, but they'd burn. Then he eyed the chair. It had been his since Colorado. Bought it off a German widow in Durango who'd told him it once belonged to a preacher. Sturdy thing. Bent oak, thick-legged. He flipped it over and ran a gloved hand along the grain. "Reckon the preacher would understand," he muttered. He smashed the legs off first, then the back, setting the pieces beside the fire pit. They'd keep him warm for half a bag's night. Next came the barn wall. The shack's lean-to shed more of a glorified closet for tools and feed, had one interior wall that faced the cabin, half-rotted but dry. He fetched his axe and knocked out the lowest board. Then another. Then another. The wind poured in like breath from a grave. He worked quick, yanking what he could, then stuffing rags in the gaps. By the time he'd finished, he had a decent pile of old wood and a cabin 10 degrees colder. The fire pit would need to make up the difference. Micah fed in a shard of the chair's back, watched it hiss, then catch. The smoke drew clean. The heat rose slow. He sat back and stared at what remained, some crates, the broken chair. The barn wall half gutted. Nothing from outside, nothing fresh, just what he could break with his own hands. He wasn't done yet. But the day was coming, the kind of day where a man burned the table he built and slept on bare boards, where memory and comfort meant less than heat. Micah rubbed his fingers together and held them near the iron lid. Still warm. The pit would hold. The fire would last. But the wood was running out. The knock came just after dusk, not loud, but deliberate. 3 slow raps, like someone afraid the door might shatter if they struck too hard. Micah Hollis froze mid-step. For a heartbeat, he thought it was the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, this time closer to the base of the door, muffled by snow but unmistakably human. He reached for the Winchester that leaned beside his cot. Loaded, safety off. He said nothing. Waited. A voice followed. "Sir, I've got 2 boys with me. We need shelter." The voice cracked from cold, not fear. It was rough, plain-spoken, and urgent. Micah didn't answer right away. He crossed the room in silence, crouched near the door, and pressed his ear to the frozen plank. No horses, no boots crunching snow, just breath and stillness. "How many of you?" he called, low and firm. 3, the man answered. "Myself and 2 sons, 12 and 14. They're freezing, sir. Please." Micah knew what that kind of cold did to children. He also knew what it did to judgment. He set the rifle down and wrestled the door latch. The ice cracked like bone. It took 3 hard jerks before the door groaned open a hand's width. Outside, the storm had finally broken, but it left its mark. Snow clung to every branch, every boot, every face. The man stood there, hunched and wide-eyed, his boys behind him barely taller than the fence posts, wrapped in gunny sacks and soaked wool. "You're late," Micah said. The man looked startled, then nodded, teeth chattering. Micah stepped aside. "Get in before I change my mind." They filed in fast, the father carrying the smaller boy, the older one stumbling like his knees no longer worked. The heat hit them like a wall. The cabin, warmed by the pit, felt like a summer barn in comparison to what they'd come through. A younger boy made a sound halfway between a cry and a cough. Micah tossed them a blanket. "Boots off. Sit near the floor. Don't crowd the pit. The heat comes up slow." The father nodded, eyes scanning the room. "Name's Connor Briggs," he said. "Boys are Eli and Caleb. We were trying for the railroad depot. Got turned around after the 2nd day of whiteout. Saw smoke. Thought maybe." Micah didn't answer. He was watching the younger boy's hands, raw, red, and curled tight. Not frostbitten yet, but close. He added another log to the fire pit. It was one he'd saved a clean slab of elm he'd meant to burn on Christmas. "It ain't much," he said, lowering the iron lid, "but it'll hold." Connor looked around the room, the buried fire, the warmth in the floor, the silence that felt earned. "What is this?" he asked. Micah shrugged. "Just a hole in the ground," he said. "That keeps breathing when the rest of the world stops." By morning, the frost on the inside walls had stopped spreading. That was the first miracle. The second was that no one had died in the night. Connor Briggs slept curled near the pit, his boots lined with rags, one arm thrown protectively over his youngest. Caleb, the older boy, had wedged himself beneath the bench without complaint. The 3 of them hadn't said much after coming in just enough to accept the warmth and settle into the silence the cabin demanded. Micah Hollis didn't sleep much. He sat upright in his cot, blanket pulled to his chin, watching the fire pit like it might betray him. There were too many bodies in the room now, too much breath in the air. Every log burned faster when there were mouths and hearts needing heat. The pit could hold them, the fire would do its part. But the wood? The wood was running out fast. By noon, Micah had burned the last of the crates, the last leg of the preacher's chair, and half of what was left of the interior barn wall. The wind had shifted, calmer now. But the door still groaned when he pushed it, not frozen, but buried deep behind snow that had drifted high as a man's chest. They weren't getting out soon. The boys began to stir. Caleb opened his eyes first, blinking at the light. The younger one, Eli, still slept, tucked beneath a coat that once belonged to Micah's brother back in the war. Connor rose next, slow, like every muscle had stiffened in the night. "You saved us," he said quietly. Micah shook his head. "Fire did." Connor looked around, taking in the room again, how the heat came from below, how the air stayed clear, how nothing smoked, nothing steamed. "This shack," he said, half laughing, "it shouldn't be standing." Micah reached for a small bundle of twigs, pine, dry, cracked from the loft. He fed one to the pit, lifted the lid slightly, waited for the draw to catch, then sealed it back. The fire moved like breath, slow and sure. "It ain't the shack that's holding," Micah said. "It's the thing under it." Connor nodded. "I've never seen anything like it." "You weren't meant to." For the next 2 days, they lived quiet. Micah rationed the wood by half logs. The boys helped pull nails from the rafters and break down the tool rack. They ate beans cooked over the coals and drank melt water warmed in a tin cup. When the fire burned low, they told stories not loud, but steady. Stories of cattle drives, storms in Nebraska, a preacher who once rode alone through Arizona with only a knife and a book. Each night, they slept closer to the floor, closer to the pit, 12 feet by 12 feet, 4 souls, 1 buried fire. It was never meant to hold that many. But somehow, by ash, grit, and the hush of heat, it did. On the morning of the 26th day, something changed. Micah Hollis felt it before he opened his eyes. It wasn't warmth, not quite the air still nipped at the tips of his ears, but the cold no longer had claws. It pressed instead of sliced. The wind had stopped. Not slowed, stopped. There was no moaning through the rafters, no tremble in the shutterboards, no snow hissing against the siding. The quiet was thick and honest, like the breath of something old exhaling at last. He swung his legs off the cot and shuffled toward the fire pit, joints stiff but working. When he laid his palm on the iron lid, it felt like touching a sleeping dog, warm, loyal, tired. Lifting it, he found a soft glow still pulsing beneath. No flame, just the last of the coals, the final heartbeat of a fire that had done more than keep a man alive. It had kept 4 alive. He added the final splinter of oak, the last he'd saved. Not for heat, but for ritual. Micah crossed to the door, set his shoulder against it, and pushed. This time it opened without a fight. The snow had sunk and crusted. The wall that had buried the entrance was giving up, slumping under its own weight. Outside, the light had changed. Not bright, not bold, but real. Blue sky peeked between bare-limbed trees. The air had a hint of moisture to it, not just bite. Ice dripped from the eaves in slow tears. A raven croaked from somewhere far off. He stepped out and breathed deep. Behind him, boots stirred. Caleb was first, followed by his younger brother, who blinked at the light like it hurt. Connor rose last, still moving like a man who hadn't slept for weeks because he hadn't, not properly. They stood in the doorway like men seeing the world for the first time. "It's over," Connor said, more a question than statement. Micah nodded once. "Not sure what day it is, but whatever it is, it ain't the same one we went to sleep in." The family stepped outside. Eli laughed a real sound when his foot sank into the softening snow. Caleb looked back once, then again, as if not wanting to leave. He walked over to the fire pit, knelt by it. "I never seen a stove like this," he said softly. "Built in the floor, hidden like that. It don't make sense." "It don't have to," Micah said. "It just has to work." The boy touched the iron lid. "It saved us." Micah nodded. "It wasn't built for comfort. It was built for when comfort runs out." Caleb rose and followed his family down the ridge, vanishing slow into the melting white. Micah stayed behind. By noon, the coals had gone black. He didn't feed them. He didn't stir them. He just placed the lid back in place, let the warmth drift down into the stone, into the grain, into the history of the boards beneath his boots, And then, in the silence of the thaw, he closed the door.